Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Benjamin Stoddert, the first Secretary of the Navy. Now, Benjamin Stoddert was in his mid-30s and a pretty successful merchant when the American Revolution broke out, and Stoddert went and joined the fight. He became a captain of a cavalry unit in the Continental Army, but at the Battle of Brandywine, he was severely wounded, and sadly, his days of warfare were over. But he could still work. After he healed up, he ends up being appointed to the Board of War, which was created by the Continental Congress to kind of oversee what George Washington was doing over in the Continental Army. It wasn't so great to have essentially Washington and the Board of War both separately in charge of the war, but what are you going to do? Benjamin Stoddert found himself as Secretary of the Board of War, which meant he was really in charge of facilitating correspondence to and from George Washington and the Continental Army, as well as the Continental Congress, and, of course, the Board of War, which was kind of like a third party in the whole thing. But we're not going to get into that because he would continue in this position until after the victory at Yorktown. And then Stoddert would return to Maryland. He'd start a business with Uriah Forrest, where they invested in property in addition to his mercantile pursuits. This business was contacted by George Washington after the Constitution was written and the United States formed, and President Washington was tasked with finding a new capital for the young nation. And Stoddert and his company were the ones who were to purchase the property on behalf of President Washington and the United States. Now, they did this in a quasi-suspicious fashion because, well, if people knew that the land they were selling was going to build the nation's capital, then that land would end up being very valuable because people were going to move to the nation's capital. So they didn't lie about much, but they didn't really tell the landowners what they were buying the land for. And in this fashion, saved the United States quite a bit of money, although unfortunately for those landowners, cost them quite a bit of money. That's okay though, because Forrest continues on working in his private business until 1798. Now, by 1798, George Washington had left the presidency and John Adams had taken over. And that's about when this quasi-war with France breaks out, and Adams realizes that he probably needs a Secretary of the Navy. Washington never had one. We can assume that he thought in his circumstance that Secretary of War would take care of this, but Adams thought it a good idea to add a Secretary of Navy. And this was done, and the choice of the day was Benjamin Stoddert. Not only had he experienced administrating the Revolutionary War, he had dealt with his merchant business with ships on the high seas, and he was thought by many to be the best candidate. And it turns out he was a very good candidate. In fact, he ends up instructing the small fledgling American Navy to aggressively attack French ships. The Quasi-War was mostly fought at sea, and the French Navy had a lot more ships than the Americans did, so you'd think the Americans might want to hide out. But no, Stoddert said, when you see a ship, attack it, because we want to put fear in the hearts of the French Navy. Kind of like the way pirates do, but instead of singular ship, pirates have one ship, the American Navy had a handful of ships. Not a whole lot of ships, but a handful of ships. And they used these ships to aggressively attack the French, and that did help bring the war to a fairly speedy resolution. In addition to this, John Adams, his cabinet was kind of famously not great. There were a lot of holdovers from George Washington's administration, which Adams did as a symbolic gesture to keep on Washington's men, though they were not Washington's men at this point, they were Hamilton's men, and it did not go very swimmingly. He ends up kind of getting angry and firing several of them. Watch out for a video this week where we interview Dr. Chervinsky. We are going to talk very deeply on that subject. You will enjoy it. But the one person in Adams' cabinet that John Adams does rely on very deeply is Benjamin Stoddert. He ends up becoming the most trustworthy person in the cabinet for President Adams. Again, the Quasi-War with France was very important. Many people at the time actually called it Stoddert's War because it was all fought at sea. He was essentially commander-in-chief of the war. Technically, John Adams was, of course, but it was all fought under the Navy. Now, probably the most interesting thing, other than being the first United States Secretary of Navy that Stoddert does, is he is instructed by John Adams to create the Navy Department Library. And the Navy Department Library started very small at first, but is still around today and is one of the leading sources on everything maritime in the world. It is arguably up there with any other library when it comes to naval information. History, shipbuilding, trade, ship driving. I know that's piloting, found it, captaining, all of that things. And we have this immense amount of information thanks to Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Stoddert. So that's a super brief wrap up of a really fascinating life. As far as founders go, he was all over the place. We touched on a lot of different subjects today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out different founders 7 days a week and lots of extra American Revolution all week long. And I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.